Hello, listeners, viewers, subscribers, lovers of truth, justice, lovers of life. I'm going to cover an important subject which should be properly in the area I call praxeology, which is a discussion of human action on a mass collective scale, and also in the context of an individual and in small scales of activity. Concerning the relationships of people in terms of their actions, either collectively and conjointly or in parallel, not necessarily in direct relation to each other, it's important to understand that there are different types of asymmetry. Let's take an individual, for example. An individual by himself is not symmetrical with his environment because there is the subjective center of consciousness around which the phenomenology of objects is constellated. There is the sense that when experiencing the properties of objects as sensations and perceptions, that they are, on the one hand, emanations of the object's characteristics, but on the other hand, they are also ways that the subjectivity takes in and interprets, gathers, and restructures in an interior way those properties and claims them as aspects of its own identity, its own nature. That's asymmetrical. The properties of the objects are, on the one hand, in one way quantifiable, in a way that is distinct from their experience, like density, the density of gold. But the luster of gold as something experienced is completely subjective in a way that's not innate to the actual element in any of its forms. That is an asymmetry between the subject and the object. Whenever there is more than one subjectivity involved in a relationship, let's just say two people, two persons, there is an asymmetry there in that the persons in their relationship interact across a barrier of objectivity through the bodies, at least in this universe of matter, in the forms of matter we experience here. So there is a bit of a gap there. Language, for example, which would enable the intimate relationship and communication of thought, which would be a very interior subjective aspect, still is a limit case of experience at the point where words are formed and their grammatical structure encodes them into streams of sounds or images which don't necessarily present meaning unless another subjectivity takes, interiorizes, and interprets those codes, those symbols, those signs, emblems, into their semantic. So again, there is a gap that has to be bridged. There is a bridge that has to be crossed in order for there to be a consummation of interaction we call communication. And for there to be a communion in a relationship, there has to be a commonality of interests and concerns around which this communication and the actions that are centered on it or in relation to it are arrayed. So in these cases, there is an asymmetry, but there's also a symmetry in that, for example, if the language, which is isomorphic between them, is understood at least in some core reference points of meaning in the same way, as in definitions assigned for terms in a contract or in a constitution or just in a colloquial use of language, then there's clearly some ground to say that what party A understands by what's being spoken between them and what party B understands are the same. Insofar as there is a good faith recognition of those terms, and insofar as there is a sameness of spirit between the two parties, which can be either individuals or groups, then there is some degree of transparency in the relationship that is understood to be in both directions. Both sides know where the other side stands in the relationship. That's a clearly just relationship in that each party has an opportunity to reframe it, revise it, reform it in light of a common understanding. And there is not simply a one-sided reference to what's held in common. There's a bipartisan, bilateral relationship toward what is held in common that is a mirror image of one side is the mirror image of the other, and vice versa. And even though that might not mean that they are exactly equal, it does mean that both sides understand where any inequalities lie. That's the important part of the relationship where symmetry is concerned. Where the asymmetry is concerned, there, as long as there's transparency about it, it doesn't breach an ethical concern for freedom to act based on each one's recognizance, in that they have knowledge and the opportunity to exercise volitional decision making through that knowledge in order to optimize their relationship in that contract. Wherever there is an asymmetry on that level, there is a serious concern, because basically there is a covert aspect to the relationship where one party holds the power to make decisions and to revise and handle concerns in the contract which the other party has no knowledge of and therefore has no ability to negotiate. In cases where in society this occurs, you have, for example, individuals who have agendas where they anticipate that they will profit, but they don't allow all other parties in the venture held in common to know the full scope of what they intend. And that's the kind of information asymmetry that makes profitability of economic activity possible. Because if that information were distributed by the person who is alone privy to it, to all other persons who could be involved, they would jump the claim, as it were. So it's not in their interest to share that information if they have it alone to themselves. Likewise, if the terms or the causes by which they arrived at that privileged information were not unjust, because fate had decided it, perhaps even God in a sense, and that they were equipped with a talent for something that the others didn't have. If it turned out that circumstances arranged for it to be that way, though nobody took any unjust measures to ensure that in advance, then that wouldn't be considered an injustice. That would just be considered fortune. And as long as everybody got some anticipated profit from the venture, that wouldn't be anyone's misfortune. It would just be more the fortune of some than of others. This isn't considered to be a fundamental asymmetry that we should be concerned about. What we should be concerned about is where this has been intentionally arranged by one party, and often to the detriment of the other party's concern. So if in society there is any group of individuals or an individual who intends to commit actions which commit to action or commit acts which enable them to gain an advantage over others, this could be considered a crime, and is considered a crime by people in most societies, just in various ways and differing ways according to the traditions and the ways that they carry out their traditions in their natural environments. In our society, we have a code that specifies that certain acts are definitely criminal acts, and this goes back all the way to ancient times, in Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, Asia. Just as one example, counterfeiting. Counterfeiting is when you take something. It doesn't have to be a currency. It can be anything that well, by analogy, anything could be counterfeited, as long as it could be made into a form that represented the value that people take for granted by the normative instances of that token or item representing a value, like, for example, money. And instead of having the substance of that value, simply present the image without the substance. So let's say that gold currency, or a currency that had gold in it at one time, had 24 carats of gold per coin. And let's just say that someone who was minting those coins took 3 carats out, but inflated the currency's weight back up to an amount that would seem as if it were the same amount of gold by weight, but was not, because 3 carats worth of gold was taken out. And in that case, you would have someone presenting to the public, whether from his own private mint or from a mint that was held as part of a public trust, an amount of gold for their use, which is not worth as much as it says it is on the coin. It does not have as much gold in it as is claimed. And of course, that's important, because if that's how much gold is in it and you melt it down, you can get that much gold out, and that's how much gold you actually have. But you're giving them less gold than you're claiming to give them if you debase the currency in that way. And then on top of it, that person keeps those 3 carats of gold per coin for themselves. So it's also stealing. But in fact, that's all counterfeiting is, in that, let's say I didn't take 3 carats out, but I simply produced a 21 carat gold coin with and labeled it or minted it to say that it was 24 carats. And then I spent it in the economy to get 24 carats of gold worth of something, but I only gave them 21 carats of gold for it. So I basically stole, on top of 21 carats of what I actually bought, another 3 carats of gold worth of whatever it is that I spent that money to get. And instead of them getting the anticipated 24 carats of gold per coin that they were expecting to get in exchange for their good or their service, they got 21. Now, that's clearly stealing, right? And so if I'm doing that, and I'm the one who first creates that money, and then they continue trading on that basis, basically they're all robbed of that amount through me. I get the major dividends from it, and then they go on transacting as if the money were worth a full 24 carats when it's worth 21 carats, but this doesn't come home to roost until they melt the gold down at some point, or until it becomes significant to find out exactly what's the carat of gold in those in those coins. But because I only had to use 21 carats to get 24 carats of gold minted into existence for my initial use, I'm the one who actually gets the benefit, in that I didn't put as much gold down in order to produce the currency to buy what I wanted, and as I claimed to have. So I stole 3 carats of gold worth per coin of everything that I bought with that money. Now everyone else is using it as if it were 24 karat gold currency. But the point is that, given that they're using it as a medium of exchange, if they just call it 24 karat gold coins, call them 24 karat gold coins, and they're exchanging values in a relation to each other, where so many of those coins represent so much of such a good or service, and so much of it represents another good or a service, and that remains stable, then their exchanges of those goods and services can be fair and just. But the point is that I gained per coin that I minted 3 carats of gold more of a value per coin than I should have gotten as the person minting that gold. Given that situation, I have stolen that from the economy. In the case where I've done that, where I've committed that counterfeiting act, when I've counterfeited money. There are other things that can be counterfeited: credibility, credit, the notion of talent can be inflated. There are various means by which all these things can be done. But if it turns out that someone has exclusive control over the currency in an economy and can print that for the economy, first of all, there's an obvious rule that the amount of currency that should be available for use in the economy should be proportional to the rates of exchange of goods and services that are already taking place in that economy, so that people can get what they want readily and can exchange off what they have readily to others. And this can flow without any need for direct barter. That's all that's all that money actually is needed for in the economy. So, in fact, you could just create fiat money, which is just to create any kind of token that represents the value of units of exchange per token of that currency, and it could be in any form as long as it couldn't be easily reproduced by anyone, because then just anyone could make it, and hence would be counterfeiting that money in that they would be producing it without authority to produce it and for their own use. It's not for the economy's use per se until after they've spent it, and then they've gotten the jump on the economy by doing that. And that's what would happen if, for example, I could just print my own money and produce no goods whatsoever, produce no service whatsoever, but I could just have money. But not money from some store that represents actual accumulated wealth, but just produce money, period, without that correlating to anything in the economy. Thereby, I am apportioning to myself goods and services from all the rest of the economy for my own use arbitrarily, without producing anything in return. Now, if I had created goods or services of any kind, and money was created to be used in the economy in proportion to that increase in wealth that I produced, that would not be counterfeiting. That would be sustaining the economy's growth with more currency. And that's what's typically done in economies in the first place, usually through centralized banking mechanisms connected to the government and authorized by the people in some way, directly or indirectly. The way that this can become a problem is obvious in that if it is done in such a way that, for example, if a banking system allows for a currency to be produced for the use of a nation, for that nation's economy, and then this is not itself an instrument of the government and hence the people, but is of a private group, which may or may not have anything to leverage that currency with. I mean, they would have to have the equivalent of holdings for themselves. They would have to have an amount of holdings of goods and services equivalent to all that money that they're giving or lending to the economy, to the nation. That would be a very serious issue, because if they did not have that amount of wealth, then of course how could they offer that amount of currency? It wouldn't really mean anything, except that they were counterfeiting if they were expected to be paid back. But here's the deal: the real issue is that in that the value of that currency, is already indicated, is its ability to allow transactions of goods and services among people without the need for direct barter. its value is strictly tied to the transactions of goods and services among those people, and its value is strictly tied to the existence of those goods and services. That's where its actual value comes from. Hence, the only service needed by that economy from anyone is from a group that's capable of creating currency as its own art and science without it being necessarily that they're creating the value in the money. That's created by the economy. So in fact, there's no need to per se borrow money from any institution in order to create a currency. It can be created just by arbitrary fiat by the economy itself. There could be industries which could arise in the economy who do this, but it's not that they are creating the value of the money and hence loaning the money or injecting the money into the economy as a value beyond its service as a currency. That's not what's going on. But it's the case that with the Federal Reserve Bank, as it's called, and other central banks similar to it around the world, they are actually presuming to offer a value equal to the amount of that currency that they're providing to the government to be used in the economy. That means that they're expecting to be paid back for that value, whereas there's no way that that could be possibly the case, that that could actually be, that money, backed by the good faith and credit of the American people, gains its value from that bank. They cannot lend that money as in toto, in mass. Sums of money can be lent to an economy by an institution, even you or me, as long as we have some value to back up the value of that money, some type of wealth. If I happen to grow tobacco and that tobacco has a value in the economy, and there is the need for some type of, for some reason there's need for money from me, the value of that money that I would offer would be equal or in proportion to the reliability of my ability to produce something of value in the economy, like growing tobacco, for example. That's exactly what would cause me to be able to ask of others goods or services that I have a good and or a service to offer them. Now, if I can produce that in a way that could have an anticipated future value, then it could be expected that you could count on having that value in the future, and hence additional sums of money could be created in anticipation of that and offered to anyone, for example, the country, the government, or private individuals or institutions, and that kind of loan could be feasible. But for a bank to have, say, a certain amount and then project a value for loaning amounts of money that is, say, 5-10 times that, based on really no direct proceeds of their own efforts of producing a good or a service of any meaningful kind, that's tantamount to fraud. So that's already an instance of a way that you could say that there is a counterfeiting process going on, even if in certain ways technically it doesn't seem to be the case. But they really don't have the authority to presume to be loaning that amount of money equal to the amount of currency in the economy. That's just simply irrational. And the mechanics of how that's been arranged in detail I'm not familiar with those. I just know that it's impossible for that to have occurred in a rational way. There has to have been some type of fallacy in the thought process, basically the equivalent of some ledger domain or so basically some kind of sleight of hand in order to make that possible. There's no way that we could be indebted to a bank as a nation, as productive as we are, to the extent that we could owe. There is just simply no way that could be the case. If somehow they have made up a story or a myth implying that would have to be deconstructed, and that should be easily done. But it's just that it seems that in order to sustain that fraud, there is an entire class, a professional class of sophists economic sophists who produce arcane gobbledygook to surround this myth with a sense of respectable intellectual respectability, so that people, without having to be very gullible but just not very knowledgeable of the nomenclature of economics, would have difficulty challenging that presumed authority and allow themselves to believe that, yes, it's possible for us to owe many times over our gross national product to a bank, which simply makes no sense whatsoever. So that would be one instance of a kind of fraud. And the entire enterprise of maintaining the myth that makes that fraud possible would involve, for example, the production of a sort of culture of academia that enshrines that myth with respectability, which is the case. And it's difficult to find in economics in the field very many scholars who go against the grain of that kind of economic theorizing. There are a few. The Austrian School of Economics is happy to count among themselves at least two of them, Ludwig von Mises and his, as it were, his later emanation or incarnation in the line of thought that he didn't per se found, but sort of collected into a more cogent theory, and that would be the work of Rothbard. And so those two economists are sort of in a vein of objectivity and countervail the prevailing climate of sophistry that allows us to believe that we could have a national debt of the sort that we do. There's also legerdemain involved in the notion of debt acquired through war, which has to do with war profiteering, where the industries involved in producing arms for war inflate the value and inflate the price of their the material and the goods they produce from it because of the notion that there is a desperate need for it, hence the value is increased, and therefore they can profit all that much more, which is ridiculous, because if those industries are rooted in a national economy and are made up of individuals loyal to that nation, then they shouldn't be allowed to get away with basically scalping the nation for the sake of helping it to arm itself in order to be defended, because then that just doesn't make sense, because they're not the ones putting their lives on the line. They're not the ones going out into battle. And the economy which made their industries possible must be defended as part of that nation's commonwealth, or else they couldn't profit from it or even exist. If they were under attack, for example, and were threatened with destruction. Of course, it raises the whole issue of transnational corporations working to profit from war on all sides of those conflicts, and that actually best describes the overall forces at play in the last few centuries when it comes to war. And actually, even back to ancient times, that's always been somewhere as part of the process of war making. So given that type of fraud being in play in our nation, we shouldn't be surprised to find a strong motive and a powerful method involved in any other type of fraud which could take place. And the social infrastructure which is built up around that, it's obvious that there is the bureaucratic graft and those types of parasites that grow up in the midst of those kinds of fraudulent enterprises, such as counterfeiting and war profiteering. That those groups are going, of course, enlist every means of intimidation and racketeering and coercion and extortion that they feel are necessary in order to maintain their hold on the golden goose, and possibly even worse, influence matters and influence situations in the world so that they can continue to exercise this power to benefit from the destruction of others and their property. And if there was ever the identity to be given to the word they or them, it would be those involved in that sort of profiteering from the suffering of others. and all the echelons of organized criminality which are associated with it.